Hey, so I don't actually have a cute little avatar to put in the corner of this video, so I'll be using this duck instead. I wanted to make this video to sort of document my art process during ArtFight. I'm not too concerned about views or making this into a full-blown channel, but I hope that this video provides some value to anyone out there who's watching this. So for the past 8 years of my journey as an artist, I've heard of ArtFight, but I've never actually considered joining until this year when I honestly don't know what changed. This decision to join ArtFight was made very last minute. I think it was literally 4 days before it started, and I was like, you know what I feel like doing right about now? Joining ArtFight. Like literally, if you go to my profile, it doesn't.
My dudes, this is my very first ArtFight. I don't know what to put here, lol.
So what is ArtFight exactly? To put it simply, ArtFight is an annual art trading event where you make art of other people's original characters, and in return, you might get your characters drawn too. Now there are a couple of terms that I wanted to define first and foremost for those who are new to this ArtFight concept. During ArtFight, if you make art of someone's character, that's called an attack. Now you're probably thinking, attack?
That sounds pretty violent.
But trust me, this is quite literally how you participate in ArtFight. So again, to attack someone means to draw their character. Additionally, they can choose to attack you back and make art of your character in return. And at that point, what they're doing is called a revenge. Also, all of the artists participating are split up into 2 teams. This year, the 2 teams were Team Stardust versus Team Seafoam. I've noticed that ArtFight is less about competition and more of like a free-for-all, where you just put yourself out there and attack whoever you want and draw whatever character you want to draw. I went ahead and joined Team Stardust because the Stardust logo was blue, and blue is my favorite color. Now, before I got started on ArtFight, I kind of wanted to make a list of goals that I wanted to achieve. I had to ask myself the question of, what do I want to practice here exactly? Obviously, we're drawing art, but what aspects of my art did I want to improve by participating in this event? And after thinking about what I have been drawing lately and what I want to achieve in the future, I made a list that boiled down to essentially 3 things. Number 1, I wanted to mainly focus on drawing humans. Number 2, I wanted to practice dynamic poses as well. And lastly, I also wanted to practice drawing movement. In other words, creating the illusion that the subject is in motion. And so with that, I went into ArtFight expecting absolutely nothing. So my first attack was actually a revenge. It was literally the first 2-3 days of ArtFight and I already got attacked, which for someone who went into ArtFight with a relatively blank slate, I didn't expect to get attacked so quickly, but shout out to K-Vision KP for being my very first attacker. And so I figured I'd dedicate my very first attack to K as a revenge. One of their OCs that I wanted to draw was this character, and her bio states that she likes to read a lot. And apparently this OC is also based off of the Murder Drones universe. Now prior to this, I didn't know what Murder Drones was, but I was just drawing whatever pose that came into mind that also incorporated a book in the pose somehow, while also making it look dynamic. But I felt like something about this pose, it looked a bit too stiff. After drawing a couple of poses that I wasn't too happy with, I decided to watch the first episode of Murder Drones just to get a better understanding of the world that this OC was inspired by. And this is when I realized that the species this OC is based off of in the show are incredibly hostile creatures. You're not going to be seeing this girl being chilling and reading a book, okay? So after watching that episode, I realized, yeah, this pose that I'm drawing right now it doesn't really showcase the personality of this character. And so back to the art, I ended up ditching the book and I completely redrew her pose to be more of like a sort of like an action pose where she's like reaching out to the camera and her hair is like flowing everywhere, and her pose suggests that she's leaping in midair. Maybe she's like in the middle of an attack or something like that. I was starting to really like how this pose was compared to the other one that I made. Now, when I was drawing this pose, I kept in mind the concept of lines of action, which essentially are lines that guide the flow of the composition. And as a result, it guides the viewer's eyes throughout the piece as well. Now, one thing, if you notice here, is that I sort of pushed the braid at the top left because I found that before it was overlapping with her hand, and I am by no means an expert at this, but from what I understand about dynamic posing, part of what makes up a good dynamic pose is that the silhouette should be easily readable. If you were to create a silhouette of this may or may not be confusing, confusing, but this I felt was much more readable. As for the light source, I was thinking of having the light come from the top left corner. The vibes that I got from the first episode while watching the show was that the atmosphere feels very bleak and snowy, so I decided to create a background with like snow particles, and I Gaussian blurred the background to make it look like this character is like in the middle of a blizzard, and we were good to go. I also added a bit of Gaussian blur to her hand as well, just to give the illusion that her hand is closer to the camera, just to add that depth of field. And yeah, that was my very first ArtFight attack. Overall, I was very happy with how this one turned out, and I'm glad that I did a bit of researching beforehand to get a better understanding of this OC. Alright, so the second attack was actually for an artist mutual that I've known for quite a while, yippeee Pinks. And one of her OCs that I wanted to draw was sort of like a human version of her pony character from the My Little Pony universe. I just really like the colors of this character, so I got to work. Because I ended up drawing so many poses for the first ArtFight attack, I was left with a lot of sketches that I felt could be repurposed into new ones. So I grabbed one of the sketches and fiddled around with it to create a new pose that I was happy with. As with most unicorns in the My Little Pony universe, they're able to use magic, and similarly, their human counterparts can also create magic as well. And I was thinking of this really cool pose where she's like sprinting towards the camera, and maybe at the same time she's like making magic with her hands in like one big swoop. And similar to the last one, this piece would almost be like a snapshot to really capture the heat of the moment. I was having a bit of trouble with the leg, to be honest, the leg that's like closest to the camera. So I did try to change it up a bit, and like that meant extending the leg a bit longer because I felt like that was a bit more, I guess, anatomically correct, but I didn't really like how it looked. Personally, I felt like by extending her leg like this, the overall movement felt just a tiny bit less impactful. So I scrapped the idea and I changed the leg back to its original position. Having the joints bend more gives a sense of force in the pose, and it conveys that feeling of running much more effectively, whereas this one looked as if she was just stretching her leg. So in the middle of coloring, I just got this sudden urge to try out a painterly style. I don't know why, honestly, like I've never really done painterly art before, but I thought it'd be interesting if I added little brushstrokes of texture here and there to almost give it that traditional painting look. Again, I don't know why, but I thought if it's any time to start experimenting with my art, it'd be during ArtFight. Because her magic is also very bright, I thought this would be a good time to like sort of practice having a secondary light source. On one side, she's being hit with the sunlight from the top right corner, and then you have the bluish lighting that's coming from inside of her palm right. I also noticed that the leg furthest away from the camera was kind of at an awkward position. Her leg is like just sort of jutting out of her front leg. I feel like it would be harder to read what's going on, so I ended up extending the back leg a bit, just so you can see like it's actually a leg that's connected to her body, right? I think that also helps to convey, again, that sense of movement, the fact that she's running. I also drew like a streak at the bottom, not only to like ground this character and imply that she's running on the ground, but also to further push the line of action, right? Because her magic is drawn one way, so I figured I'd further exaggerate that line of action by drawing like a trail. Again, it's not really necessary, but I thought it would exaggerate the movement a bit more. And lastly, I added some sparkle effects to the magic, and yeah, that was my second ArtFight attack. I think I really liked how this piece turned out as well, and personally, I think I was able to convey that energy and that burst of excitement with this pose. Alright, so attack number 3. This attack was for a user by the name of Mutmu, and one of their characters is this old man scientist. Of all the attacks I've done this year, I think this was the one that gave me the most trouble. It had nothing to do with the character himself, by the way. It was more of a skill issue on my end, to be honest, and I'll explain why in a bit. Also, just to very quickly go back to my preparation before ArtFight started, during those 5 days leading up to ArtFight, I realized that I didn't have any proper reference sheets for my characters, so I was rushing to get all those done, which is exactly what seasoned ArtFight veterans advise against doing, and I did exactly that. Anyway, going back to the art here, once I put down the lighting, I was looking at it from afar, and to be honest, I really just hated how this was turning out, but I couldn't really place my finger on why. In fact, ArtFight was ending in a couple of days, but I was just so upset with my art here that I ended up taking a break for like 2 days. Now, I think the issue here was that the lighting looked like it was coming from 2 different places. If you focus on these areas of the subject, the light source almost appears to be slightly behind it. However, as for these areas, it looks like the light is also to the left, but slightly in front of him. Again, it almost feels like there's 2 different light sources, and I didn't really like how that looked. If I wanted to achieve lighting that looked a bit more realistic, I was gonna have to choose between one of the 2 light sources. At this point, I did something I thought I'd never do, which was merge my layers together. I know, But again, I didn't really like how this attack was going anyway, so I didn't really care if I messed up. I think the problem here was that when I was putting down the shadows for this character initially, I shaded each body part individually instead of considering the larger shadows of the subject as a whole first. Remember, always try to create larger simple shapes first and then add the details after, and that applies to the shapes of your shadows as well. Ultimately, I wanted to challenge myself a bit here, so between the two light sources, I decided to stick with the light coming from behind him. Anyway, after I realized that, I had this newfound motivation to keep going, now that I figured out the enigma that was the lighting situation. And so I had to redo a lot of the shadows here. At that point, I made a new layer, set it to multiply, and I went in with a dark bluish color, and I started blocking out large areas where I thought would be covered in shadow, assuming that the light source is coming from the left and slightly behind him. I also blocked out like half of his face with shadow as well, and that's because if the light is coming from slightly behind him, the other half of his face would most likely be covered in shadow too, right? And now that the shadow was much darker, I felt like it was a lot easier to add the bounce light. I think merging my layers together actually worked really well in favor of the painterly style I was aiming for, because it forced me to paint over my mistakes and improvise, which added on to the painterly aesthetic. And because of this new technique, I felt less stakes when working on this, and it actually encouraged me to be more experimental with my art. And in the end, I added an overlay layer on top of everything else. I put it like this bluish tint to everything, just to sort of like unify all the colors together. This guy probably works like in a science lab with like fluorescent lighting, right? So I figured like a bluish tint would sort of fit the vibe, if that makes sense. I really liked how this turned out. I guess by cutting off his legs and drawing only part of his lab coat, I kind of missed out on being able to fully imply a clear line of action. And while I wasn't really able to convey that sense of movement in this piece, I was happy to have made up for it with the dramatic lighting and shading. So sometime during my third attack, the one that you just saw, it was announced that ArtFight was being extended by 2 full days. And I was like, oh my god! Because without that extension, this attack would not have been possible. So anyway, my fourth and final attack was for Tsukasa Minami, and one of their OCs that stuck out to me in particular was a Splatoon based OC. I haven't played Splatoon myself, but regardless, I really liked this guy's hair colors especially. I decided right off the bat that I'm probably not going to be able to draw a full body, so I ended up going for more of like a half body pose, I guess. One of the main challenges that I was faced with for this attack was, how do I draw a dynamic pose with only half a body? When you search up dynamic poses on Google, most of the images you find will be of poses that utilize the entire human body. This is because it's easier to create a line of action using our full body length. As a result, coming up with a half-bodied dynamic pose with a clear line of action was going to be a bit of a challenge for me. After much brainstorming, I looked back at the ref sheet for this character and I realized that he's holding a cigarette, and at that point I was like, in case none of that made sense, my big brain idea was to use the smoke coming from his cigarette to create my main line of action. I think I really like how the hair ended up turning out, especially with the shading. I tried to do something cool with the smoke, where the smoke itself is made up of very rough brushstrokes, which contrast the character himself, who I rendered much more smoothly. Had I managed my time better, I would have thought of a more interesting background. Ultimately, I decided to remove the background and posted this attack just a few hours before the deadline. And despite the time constraints for this attack, I'm really proud of the foreshortening on his arm and the movement implied by the smoke here. Overall, with 2024 being my very first year of ArtFight, I had a lot of fun this year, and as cliche as it may sound, my only regret is that I didn't join earlier. To be honest, I was hoping to get at least 5 attacks in this year, but I'm glad I was still able to try out new techniques with the 4 that I've drawn. I've already bookmarked a ton of OCs for next year's ArtFight, and I'm really looking forward to it. As for this YouTube channel, I don't expect this to be a regular thing, but I think this would be a good place for me to create any behind the scenes types of videos for my art. Please go check out and support everyone that was mentioned in this video. I'll see you, I don't know,